Good evening. Tonight's class is dedicated by his family in the loving memory of Reb Menachem Nochem Reb Moshe Cordovero, in tribute to his 30th yahrzeit on the 21st day of Tammuz. Reb Nochem Cordovero of blessed memory was born in 1922 in the famous city of Brisk in Lithuania. His father, Reb Moshe Yitzchak, as well as his grandfather, his great-grandfather, was the Sheichet, the ritual slaughterer of Brisk, and was very close to the legendary Brisker Rav, Reb Velvele Brisker, Reb Yitzchak Ze'ev Halevi Soloveitchik. And at the suggestion of the Brisker Rav, Reb Moshe Yitzchak, the Sheichet, sent his son Nochem to study in Lubavitch, in the Lubavitch Yeshiva, which was located in the city of Otwock, a suburb of Warsaw in Poland. It's interesting that because of the suggestion of the Brisker Rav, young Nochem was actually saved. His parents, as most of his family, were exterminated with the entire community of Brisk by the Germans in 1942. But he was learning in Otwock, so he escaped with many yeshiva students to Vilna, and from Vilna he managed to make it to Japan, from Japan to Shanghai in China. He was one of the Goylei Shanghai, and then after the war in 1946 settled in New York. He became a chassid and very connected to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and was a well-known activist and a big bal chesed, a very kind and caring person. Tehei nishmasai tzurura b'tzroir hachayim. So tonight's class is dedicated by his family in his loving memory. It's also dedicated by our dear friends David and Ida Schattenstein in the loving memory of Alter Shula, Bas Reb Yosef Yitzchak and Hindel Swerdlov, and Lahavdil ben Chaya L'Chaya Chayim in honor of their daughter, Yeta Alter Shula, known as Aliyah Schattenstein. Tonight, we're going to explore a difficult issue, the mystery of death, based on a eulogy that was presented a few hundred years ago by the Arizal Rabbi Isaac Luria, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, at the funeral of his master, the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. Today, the 23rd day of Tammuz, Chav Gimel Tammuz, happens to be the yahrzeit of one of the great Kabbalists, one of the greatest Kabbalists and mystics and luminaries in Jewish history, known by his acronym as the Ramak. Ramak stands for Rabbeinu Moshe Cordovero, or Moses Cordovero. His last name was Cordovero, and most historians assume that the family came from the city Cordoba in Spain, and hence the last name Cordovero. Rabbi Moshe Cordovero was born in the year 1522, which means 30 years after the expulsion of Spanish Jewry in 1492, on the 9th day of Av, when the entire community of Spain, of Sfard, was expelled from Spain. So he was born 30 years later in 1522 and passed away on the 23rd day of Tammuz of the Hebrew year Shin Lamed, 1570. At the age of 48, he is interred in the old cemetery of Tzefas, of the city of Safad. Now, A few words about the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. He lived in Tzfas. He married the sister of a very well-known Kabbalist, great mystic and sage, Rabbi Shloime Elkabetz. The Ramak, I'm going to call him the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, married the sister of Reb Shloime Elkabetz. Reb Shloime Elkabetz is the one who composed the famous poem of Licha Doidi Likraskala Pnei Shabbos Nekabla, recited Friday night universally in Jewish communities the world over. The Ramak was a student of the legendary Beis Yosef, Rabbeinu Yosef Karo, the author of the commentary of the Kesef Mishnah on the Rambam, on Maimonides' Code of Law, and of course, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. Ramak was one of his students. The Ramak was ordained by the famous Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, and the Ramak founded a yeshiva where they specifically taught Kabbalah. Some of his students became the very well-known Kabbalists, among them Rabbi Chaim Vital, who would later become the editor of the writings, of the teachings of the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria. He became the teacher of the Reishis Chachma, Rabbi Eliyahu Dividash, who authored the famous book on Jewish ethics and mysticism, Reishis Chachma, and the Arizal himself, the greatest Kabbalist in Jewish history, Rabbi Isaac Luria, when he came to Tzfas for an amount of time, was a student of the Ramak, of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. Now, the magnum opus of the Ramak is no question his monumental work known as Pardes Rimoinim, the Orchard of Pomegranates. What he accomplished in that work was something extraordinary and fabulous. He created an encyclopedia in a very organized and systematic fashion of all of the Kabbalistic literature that was available till his day. Anybody who knows even a little bit about Kabbalah knows that the literature of Kabbalah is very complicated and very mystical and very abstract and very hard to organize in a systematic way. And the Ramak made a book called Pardes Rimoinim, the Orchard of Pomegranates, divided into 32 portals, Lamed Beis Shiarim. Each portal is dedicated to another subject discussed in Kabbalah. Each portal has many chapters. And in that portal, he basically compiles all of the information available on that particular subject. He organizes it, he explains it, he reconciles contradictions from different sources, and hence the Ramak was the first one to present a systematic doctrine of Kabbalah in its entire scope, available in all of the literature of Kabbalah, from Sefer Yetzirah, the famous book of formation, of creation, to obviously the book of Zohar, the foundational book of Kabbalah, and all of the other Kabbalistic texts. The Ramak also authored an extraordinary commentary on the Zohar, the most foundational book, the most foundational Kabbalistic work known as the Zohar, which means light, the book of light, the book of splendor. The commentary is known as Oir Yakar. It's an extraordinary commentary of dozens and dozens of volumes, and I have to tell you that till a few years ago it was never published. It was never printed. Just a few years ago, the Oir Yakar was finally published completely, the entire commentary of the Ramak on the Zohar. The Ramak also wrote other works. He wrote a book on ethics called Toimer Dvora, the palm tree of Devora, where he explains the 13 attributes of mercy in an ethical and personal way. He composed a very highly mystical book about his own mystical experiences called Sefer Gerushin. He wrote a book about the necessity to learn Kabbalah called Of another very profound book called Elima, wrote a book called Tefillah LaMoshe, a book Zivchei Shlomim, and other works authored by the legendary Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, who passes away at the age of 48 in 1570, today on the 23rd day of Tammuz, and he's buried in the city of Tzfas. At his funeral, he was eulogized by a very young man who came to Tzfas not a long time before him, and became a student of the Ramak. And his name was Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, Rabbi Isaac Luria, who came to be known as the Arizal. After the Ramak passes away, the Arizal, for the next 2 years, until his own death in 1572 on the 5th day of Av, Shin Lamed Beis, only 2 years later, becomes the successor of the Ramak, but during those 2 short years, revolutionizes the landscape of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. The Arizal transformed and metamorphosized Kabbalah, and his most important disciple and student, Rabbi Chaim Vital, who was already a student of the Ramak, as I mentioned earlier, but then went on to become a student of the Arizal, transcribed most of the works of the Arizal and writings which we have today. And in these 2 short years, the Arizal changed the face of Kabbalah. It's fascinating what the man taught in these 2 years, and then he died at a very young age, either at the age of 38 or 36. There are different opinions, but he died 2 years later, in, as I said, 1572 on the 5th day of Av. I was just a few days ago in the holy city of Tzfas and had the great privilege of visiting and praying both at the resting place of the Arizal and at the resting place of the Ramak. At the Ramak's funeral, the Arizal, who happens to be buried very close to him in the old cemetery of Tzfas, eulogized him. And at his eulogy, he said something very, very special. The Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, quoted a verse from Deuteronomy, from the Parsha of Kiseitze, the portion of Kiseitze. And I want to quote to you this verse. You have it in your curriculum. Please open your curriculum to source number 1. Right below the video, there's a PDF document with a curriculum. And take a look at the verse that the Arizal quoted at the funeral of the Ramak. V'chiyeh be'ish chet mishpat moves v'humas v'salisa oisei al eitz. Literally, it means if somebody will have a sin that will warrant the verdict of death, vuhumas, and he receives the death penalty, you should hang him on a tree. This is referring to, as the sages explain, to certain individuals who committed very serious crimes and received the death penalty. And it was not easy to receive the death penalty in the Jewish court. In the days of yore, it was very, very, very difficult to receive the death penalty, but sometimes a person did receive it, and in certain instances the Torah instructs us to hang his corpse on a tree. His corpse on a tree. And the Torah continues that even when you do that, you're never allowed to keep the corpse overnight. It must be buried the same day, and practically speaking, it was only hanging for very few minutes, but it cannot be there overnight. We know every single verse and pasuk in the Torah has many layers of interpretation. So at the funeral of the Ramak, the Arizal eulogizes him, quotes this verse, and presents a deeper homiletical interpretation to the verse. This eulogy is quoted in the famous book known as Yarois Dvash by Reb Yonis in Eibschitz, the famous German rabbi of the 18th century. It's also quoted by the Chida, Rabbeinu, the famous Italian sage of the 18th century, Rabbeinu Chaim Yosef David Azulai, in his book Nachal Kedumim on Parshas Kiseitze, in another book of his known as Dvarim Achadim. It's quoted by the famous Rabbi Yeshaya Horowitz, the 17th and 18th century sage, Rabbi Yeshaya Horowitz, the Shalah. And in source number 2, we have the quote of the Arizal's interpretation as it is quoted by Reb Yonis and Eibschitz in his book Yaris Dvash. Please open up source number 2 in the curriculum. Let's read together. V'chiyeh be'ish chet mishpat moves. Pirush. Sheyechsar chet miloshen chisaron tam mishpat moves ki leipal ra v'lo mayamos. The Arizal explains the verse this way. Kiyeh v'ish chet mishpat moves. The word chet in Hebrew has 2 meanings. It means a sin, a transgression. It also means a void, a flaw, something lacking. Chet miloshen chisaron, something is lacking. Kiyeh v'ish chet mishpat moves. If there's a particular person, and in this person's life there is missing a mishpat moves, there is missing the justification for his death. You look at a person who passed away and you ask one question: why did this person have to die? Why did this person have to pass away? The Arizal says, there is missing, there is lacking a mishpat, a seeming justice, seeming justification for this person's death. There was no reason this person deserved to die. No sins, no blemishes, no transgressions, no violations. But vuhumas, but the person did die. Zok da Arizal, loy Paul ra, he did not do anything bad. V'lama yamos, why should he die? V'talisa oisalates. Hang it on the tree. Put it up on the tree. Blame it on the tree. Machmas eitz hadas shegozar misa b'shvil kachmeis. It's because that legendary famous tree of knowledge, when Adam and Eve eat from the tree, God tells Adam in Bereshis, in the first portion in Genesis, the day you eat from this tree, you're going to die. As a result of the first human beings eating from that tree of knowledge, which was forbidden to them, death was introduced into the world. Ubishvil kach mei, says the Arizal, that's why he died. So imagine the Arizal is standing at the funeral of the Ramak, and he's basically explaining that here we have a person like Reb Moshe Cordovero that you wonder, why did he have to die? Such a holy, sacred, righteous person. And the Arizal says, V'salisa Yisrael hates, blame it on the tree. It's not because of him. It's because of the tree. Now, these are the words of the Arizal. Let's try to analyze and dissect what is he saying. There's a famous statement made in the Talmud and Gemara in two places. In Masechta Shabbos, Daf Nun Heyamid Beis, Shabbos 55b, and in Masechta Baba Basra, Daf Yud Zayin Amar Aleph, Baba Basra 17a. And the second one I brought you in the sources. Please open up your curriculum to number 3. Zog the Gemara, Tonu Rabbanon, the rabbis taught, Arba Meisu Be'etya Shel Nachash. 4 people died because of the snake. Ve'eluhain, these are their names. Binyamin ben Yaakov, Benjamin the son of Jacob, Amram Avi Moshe, Amram the father of Moshe Rabbeinu, Yishai Avi David, Yishai the father of King David, and Kilov ben David. King David had many children. His second son, born from his wife Avigail, his name was Kilov, and he was the 4th figure to die because of the snake. Says Rashi, continue in source number 3. Zok Rashi, Be'etyo shel nachash, because of the snake. What does this mean? Be'etzoso shel nachash, as a result of the scheme and the advice of the serpent to Eve to eat from the forbidden tree. Keloimar, this means, says Rashi, Loi hayu ru'uyin lamos, these 4 people were not worthy of death. Ela shenigzera gzeiras misa, al kol toldosav shel adam harishon. However, a decree of death was issued forth on all of the descendants of the first human being of Adam Harishon, ba'atzasor shel nachash, because of the scheme of the serpent. The serpent who in Bereshis entices and persuades Chava, Eve, to eat from the tree, and she gives from the fruit also to her husband, to Adam, to eat. As a result of the serpent, death was introduced into the story of existence, and these 4 people died only because of the snake. Their death has nothing to do with their shortcomings, with their failure, with their sins, with their weaknesses. It's all to be blamed on the snake. Arba Meisu Bet Yishal Nachash. Now, when we learn this Gemara, and then we hear about the eulogy that the Arizal gave for the Holy of Holies, the Ramak, Reb Moshe Cordovero, it seems like, at first glance, that the Arizal is merely adding a 5th person to the list of the Gemara. The Gemara says there are 4 people who died because of the snake, who Binyamin, the son of Yaakov, Amram, the father of Moshe, Yishai, the father of David, and Kilov, the son of David. Comes the Ramak and says there's 1 more who died because of the snake. Who? Reb Moshe Cordovero. Obviously, he's not mentioned in Gemara. He died in 1570, sometime after the Talmud was completed and composed. But the Arizal is adding a 5th person. 1 more person died because of the nachash, because of the snake. However, when we examine and study the Arizal's words more carefully, we see that it's not exactly so, because there is a subtle but significant distinction between the phraseology used in the Talmud and the phraseology employed by our holy master, the Arizal. In the Gemara, the Talmud, the term that's used is Meisu Be'etyer Shel Nachash. They died because of the snake. The Arizal introduces another word, V'salisa Yisrael eitz. Blame it on the tree. Now you might say the 2 are identical. What did the snake do? The snake enticed Chava to eat from the tree. So what's the difference if you say they died because of the snake or they died because of the tree, right? It's ultimately because of the snake who enticed them to eat from the tree. But the fact that the Arizal does not use the terminology of Gemara. In fact, he ignores the terminology of Gemara. He didn't get up at the funeral and say, Arba meisu bet yeshel nachash, 4 people died because of the serpent, and there's also the Ramak, and then bring a verse. Rather, he developed a new pasuk, an original pasuk, to explain the reason for the Ramak's death. And the pasuk uses the word eitz. It seems, it's apparent that the Arizal was saying something different, or something else, or something new. Because in Torah, words are meticulous, and the choice of words are always very precise. And when there's a choice of one word used over another word, even though the two are connected to the same theme, that requires from us to look deeper and to dissect it. Especially it's true when we're dealing with Kabbalah. Because in Kabbalah, the Kabbalah saw every word, even syllables, even letters, as extremely meticulous, especially the teachings of the Ramak and the Arizal. So when it comes to studying the words of the Arizal, it behooves us to gaze deeper and to understand why he changed it from the serpent to the tree. 30 years ago, Shabbos, Parshas Matos, happened to be the 23rd day of Tammuz, the Yortzeit, the anniversary of passing of the Ramak. The Lubavitcher Rebbe held a public farbrengen, a gathering at his shul at 770 Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn. This is Shabbos Matos, the 23rd day of Tammuz, 1981, Tafshin Amalef. And happened to dedicate an entire talk, a long talk, to explain the meaning behind the eulogy of the Arizal on the Ramak. I should mention, and this is also interesting, very interesting, that this sikha, this talk about the eulogy of the Arizal on the Ramak, was presented 2 days after the passing of Reb Moshe Cordovero, who I mentioned at the beginning of the class. He passed away Thursday on the 21st day of Tammuz, and Shabbos, the 23rd day of Tammuz, was this very interesting talk about the eulogy of the Arizal on the Ramak. In that talk, the Lubavitcher Rebbe suggested that the Arizal was not just imposing the commentary of Gemara on a pasuk, but he was actually defining a new idea, a new concept. The distinction between the snake and the tree is very important. The snake is what the Gemara says. 4 people died because of the snake. The Arizal says, blame it on the tree. The distinction is a subtle one, but an important one. The snake is that creature who actively persuaded Chava to betray God's will not to eat from the tree. And we know that the serpent was punished for it, which means apparently the serpent had some level of free choice, of intelligence. The pasuk says, "Hanocha shaya orum." The serpent was clever, was sly, was shrewd, was sophisticated. And therefore the serpent was punished for what it did. So it actively engaged in an act of betraying God, enticing Eve to betray God. However, we want to explain the motivations of the snake. That's not for tonight's class. Go explain the motivation of a snake. It's not for now. That's the snake. When you mention the tree itself was not involved in sin. The tree itself actually was a delicious tree, it was a beautiful tree, and it was planted and created and planted in the garden by whom? By God, by Hashem. He's the one who created the tree, he's the one who made the tree, he's the one who planted the tree, and he's the one who told Adam, you can eat from every tree in the garden, but from this tree, don't eat. In fact, according to our sages, they derive from the verses that the tree was either a fig tree, or an esrog tree, a citron tree, or a chita, it was wheat. Or a fourth opinion is a geffen, it was a vine, it grew grapes, a grape tree. which actually 3 of these opinions are from the Shivas Haminim Shenishtabche B'Meretz Yisrael. They're from the 7 species with which the Holy Land was praised. Figs, wheat, and grapes. The 4th opinion, it was an esrog tree. It's called Pri Eitz Hadar, a beautiful fruit. The tree itself was not negative. The tree itself was not evil. The tree is called Eitz Hadas, Tov Ra. It's a mixture of goodness and negativity. It's called Eitz Hadas, a tree from what you get knowledge, but the tree itself was planted there by God in the garden. It was there before the sin, and it created the possibility for Adam and Chava to eat from it and sin. So who is responsible for the tree? That's God's responsibility. He's the one who planted the tree, and he's the one who told Adam, don't eat from this tree. Which really means that Hashem wanted. He created the possibility. He wanted there to be a possibility for Adam to eat from the tree, for Adam to be enticed to eat from the tree. If not, he wouldn't plant it. If not, he wouldn't create it. If not, he wouldn't even warn him not to eat it. By warning him not to eat it, there is already a relationship. Would Adam even have noticed the tree? There's a tree of garden of who knows how many trees. And God says, by the way, that tree don't eat. We know with children, if you want them to read a book, what do you tell them? You say, this book you're not allowed to read, right? Or in school, if you want them to read a particular chapter, you say, this chapter we have to skip. The other chapters that you don't skip, that they might not know. But the chapter that you have to skip, that everybody knows. They say in history, one of the most successful things for a book is if it's banned. If it's excommunicated, then it becomes a famous book. If somebody's excommunicated, they often become a celebrity. As long as you're not excommunicated, you don't become a celebrity. When we tell everybody how bad you are, suddenly there's interest. Who's this guy? By Hashem saying, this tree don't eat, there was already a relationship created between Adam and the tree. Here, this tree you're not allowed to eat. And this is based on a fascinating and difficult to understand observation in the Medrash. The Medrash Tanchum in the portion of Ayeshev quotes that book, that verse in Tehillim Psalms chapter 25. Look at the actions of God. How awesome is his libel on people. And the Tanchum gives many examples and explains that, we often blame different events on the people. We blame Adam for death. And we blame Moshe for not going into Egypt because he hit the rock. But the Medrash says, Noira lila bnei Adam, this is ultimately a libel that God imposes upon people. But if he didn't allow it, it would have never happened. Hashem wanted to create a possibility for these things to happen. He wanted that Adam should have the ability to eat from the tree, even though he told him not to. And Adam had free choice. But who ultimately allowed there to be a tree and Adam should eat it and the consequences should be death? That comes from God. And this is the difference between how the Gemara, the Talmud talks about the 4 people who died, and how the Arizal spoke about the death of the Ramak. The Gemara is part of Torah, which we call Nigla, which means the revealed, the exoteric, the exposed part of Torah. So the Gemara discusses why did these people die? The association is the serpent. They died because of the serpent. They didn't die because of their own sins. They didn't die because of their own shortcomings, because of their own dissonance from God, because really the only thing that endures forever, the only thing that has a true absolute existence and life is God. And everything that's connected to God, that's one with God, also lives forever, which is why the soul lives forever. As a result, from eating from the tree of knowledge, a dissonance was created between a human being and God. The ego was introduced, a part of us that feels completely disconnected from God. The body became detached from its source. And it's subjected to mortality, it's subjected to death, it's subjected to deterioration. It doesn't have the power of eternity because only God endures forever. So before they ate from the tree of knowledge, when the human being was completely one with the divine, there was no death, because the divine doesn't die and the human being is an extension of the divine. When they ate from the tree and now there is dissonance, there's fragmentation between the source and the person. So there's a concept of illness, of deterioration and death. But then there are 4 people who died not because of their own issues, not because of their own challenge, not because of their own shortcomings, not because of their own ego or narcissism or detachment or dissonance. They were great tzaddikim. They died only be'etir shel nachash, because of the serpent. But the Gemara identifies the culprit. Who's the culprit for their death? The serpent. Because that's what happened. The serpent is the one who actively persuaded Chava to eat from the tree. Kabbalah is called Pnimiyus HaTorah, the inside of Torah. Kabbalah looks to trace back everything to its ultimate source, its ultimate origin. There's 2 terms in Hebrew, chitzonius and pnimius, the external and the internal. You sometimes look at a reality, you could see it externally. You sometimes look at a reality and you get to the core of it, to the pnimius, to the source of it. Right? I can look at a person and see your chitzonius. I could see your external layers. You could look at yourself and see only your external layers. And then you could go look at the pnimius. You could look at the deeper. You could look at the neshama, get the soul out of it. Torah has 2 dimensions. Just like a person has a body and a soul, Torah has a body and a soul. As the Zohar states in Parshas Baloischa, there's Gufa Doiraisa and Shmosa Doiraisa. Zois HaTorah Adam, the Pasuk says. Torah is like a human being. Torah is like a living organism. There's the body of Torah, the concrete, substantial, exhibited, displayed, pragmatic, physical, practical element of Torah. This is called Nigla, the revealed. Gufa Dorais, the body of Torah. Torah also has what we call Kabbalah, Pnimiyus HaTorah, the essence of Torah. Hence the difference between how the Gemara talks about the death of a tzaddik and how the Arizal talks about the death of a tzaddik. The Gemara Nigla of Torah, the body of Torah, identifies the external cause for their death as the serpent. Kabbalah goes back to the shoirish, it goes back to the root, it goes back to the pnimius, to the inside. And it says, ultimately, it's the tree. And who planted the tree? The tree is Hashem. Ultimately, the reason they died is, this is what God wanted. It's part of a divine, mysterious, transcendent plan that often defies the human imagination. Yes, it came about through a serpent, and it came about through Eve, and it came about through Adam. That's all true. Noira alila al bnei Adam. The plot is developed in a way that it happens through people, and the people are blamed. They have free choice, and God told them not to do it. But ultimately, who allowed it to happen? Who created the backdrop? Who facilitated the dynamics? V'salisa oiseh alei, it's blame it on the tree. In life, if you look at the stories of your life, at the experiences of your life, you can always blame certain people. Because this person did this, and this person did that. This person was a snake, and this snake was a person. And it's true. Life's experiences play themselves out through people. On a nigla level, it's true. On a revealed level, that's true. Kabbalah, the Arizal, comes to tell us, V'salisa oiseh alei. Ultimately, it happened because God allowed it to happen. He wanted it to happen. He wanted this possibility, more accurate. He wanted this possibility. I want to tell you a story. It's not an easy story to retell. It's a very, very emotionally charged story. And I want you to try to put yourself into, I wanted to say, to put yourself into the shoes of the people we're going to be discussing. That's impossible. I cannot put myself into their shoes, and probably most of you or many of you cannot. But at least to try to internalize it, to try to relate to what they were going through. It's a story about a fascinating rabbinic character whose name was Reb Moshe Ber Weissmandel. Reb Moshe Ber Weissmandel is a Jew who's born in the city Debrecen in Hungary. becomes a great rabbi, a great sage, a bibliographer, a researcher, an academic. Teaches in the yeshiva of his father-in-law in the city of Nitra in Hungary. And then, like all of the Jews of Eastern Europe, an Hungarian Jewry is confronted with the dark, hellish reality of the Second World War and the Holocaust. Reb Michal Ber Weissmandl threw himself into the Avodas HaHatzalah, the work of rescuing Jews. He was very involved in delaying the deportation of Slovakian Jewry, and then was involved in negotiations with Adolf Eichmann Yamach Shemoy V'Zichroi to spare the 900,000 Jews of Hungary from being deported to the death camp of Auschwitz and Birkenau. Reb Michal Ber Weissmandl transcribes his experiences and his negotiations in his famous book Min HaMeitzar, which was published after his passing. Here is not the place to get into the details, but the Germans were willing, as Reb Michal Ber describes it, to be bribed by money, a huge amount of money at that time, not to exterminate Hungarian Jewry, around $2 million. Reb Michal Ber did not rest day and night to try to get the money, to no avail. In his book, he blames many Jewish leaders for being passive, for being apathetic, for not believing, for being involved in other things, for having other agendas. And the famous book Perfidy by Ben Hecht accuses those leaders, Zionist leaders and other leaders, for turning a blind eye to hundreds of thousands of Jews who could have been saved from Nazi Germany. Now, this story has been debated for many, many years. Although recently many historians have come to approve the version of the story of Reb Michal Ber Weissmandl because of documents that have been released and discovered, but it's beyond the focus of the class. At the end, Reb Weissmandl was deported with his family to Auschwitz. His entire family was exterminated. They were gassed in the gas chambers. He himself hid a sword of sort in challah and bread, and he jumped out of the train. And his life was saved. This is in 1944. But all of his attempts to save Hungarian Jewry were futile. He sent messages to FDR, President Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, the Pope Pius XII in Rome. He begged that the Allies, the first one to beg the Allies to bomb the railway tracks going to Auschwitz. You have to remember, in 1944, the Germans excelled. Their mechanism was impeccable and flawless. There was a point that 12,000 Jews were being gassed in a single day in Auschwitz. 12,000 Jews a day. And Reb Michal Ber got early reports from people who escaped Auschwitz, and he begged the Allies. He sent letters, he sent messages, he tried to alarm the Jewish world, the non-Jewish world, doing everything to bomb, to save, to rescue, to pay. At the end, we know that Hungarian Jewry went up in flames. Reb Michal Ber was saved, but his soul never left the Holocaust. He never came back to himself. He was a broken man. After the war, he was in a hospital for a very long time. He was crushed. Whenever he would go back to that subject, he could not contain himself. He was tormented to his core. I mean, imagine the person who was in the thick of things and felt in front of his eyes the possibility to save so many Jews, so many Kinderlach, and it just didn't happen. He arrived in the United States in 1946, and he went to visit a great master, a great man, an extraordinary leader, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. who himself lost many of his family members, including a daughter, in the Holocaust, lost many of his own Hasidim and disciples either in Poland or in Russia under Stalin, and was himself a very broken and ill man physically. And he escaped Warsaw and arrived March 1940 to New York, ultimately settled on 770 Eastern Parkway, and lived there for 10 years till his passing in 1950. Reb Moshe Cordovero came to visit the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. And he went into the Rebbe, and he sat there, and he shared everything that occurred, and everything that could have occurred, and everything that did not occur. He wept and wept and wept. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe sat and listened attentively to every word, to every syllable, to every sigh. He absorbed every tear of Rabbi White Weissmandel. Where Reb Moshe Cordovero finished his horrific tale, the Rebbe said to him this. Said, Reb Moshe Cordovero, Sof kol sof, vera tes alts getan. At the end of the day, after everything is accounted for, and everything is recalled and recounted and said and done, who is really responsible for what happened? Who is the one who really allowed it to happen? And the Rebbe said, der Eberster. It was Hashem. It was God. And with this, the Rebbe infused a soul, a future, into the fragile, pure heart of Reb Moshe Cordovero Weissmandel. He never recovered, to be sure. Whenever he would mention the Holocaust, whoever remembers Reb Moshe Cordovero, and there are tapes recordings of his, he went right back there. He could never get over it. He never really returned completely. But he rebuilt his yeshiva of Nitra in New York, in Mount Kisco, upstate New York, Westchester County. He built a beautiful Nitra yeshiva. He was a broken man, but he rebuilt his yeshiva. It was called the farm yeshiva. It was a yeshiva together with a farm. He died a young man in his 50s, at the age of 54, in 1957, Kislev Tavshin Yud Ches. But the words of the Lubavitcher Rebbe gave him some perspective, some comfort. He remarried a second wife. He had another family, children, 5 children. The Rebbe could say it to him. What the Rebbe was saying is, you're right. You're right. The apathy that occurred during the Holocaust, after everything that was written, has still not been written, has still not been transcribed. The larger world, Veret, certainly, but even among ourselves. And it's perhaps even too tragic and too painful to describe. I mean, if you read Ben Hecht's book, Perfidy, your blood boils for a few weeks. Very, very hard to digest, almost impossible to digest. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, Reb Moshe Cordovero, I know. This one, that one, that one, that one, and ultimately the Germans, that Nazi beast who looked like cultured, who were cultured, scientific, developed people, and yet managed to engage in the most barbaric atrocities in the history of humanity, with glee gassing 1.5 million children, while at night going to listen to the beautiful symphonies of Mozart and Beethoven and Bach and Wagner. It's all true. All of these are to blame and deserve to be punished. But what he was telling Reb Moshe Cordovero is V'salisa Israelites. How do Jews have the power to go on, to continue believing in life, to continue to grow and build and prosper and give their children love and ultimately choose life over death? It's because V'salisa Israelites. They believe that ultimately, of course, the snake is guilty. The snake did it. But the reason the snake could do it is because God planted a tree. Sof kol sa veres es als getan. Der Eberster, God. And when the Jews knew that their Father in heaven was ultimately responsible, it gave them the ability not to understand and not to always find consolation and not to make peace with the travesty, but to sense that on some level there's a meaning, there's a purpose, there's a spark, there's still hope, there's a future, it's part of a plan. It allowed them to continue to live and not to despair and disintegrate and fall apart. And because of their choices for thousands of years, we are here today talking about it. So the Gemara talks about the external layer. Arba Meisi Bet Yishal Nachash. The Arizal takes us to the source, to the core, and he says, V'salisa Israelites. He's the one who created the challenge. He's the one who made the Nisayan. He's the one who made the test that Adam and Chava fell through. There's something deeper. When we say 4 died because of the snake, what it really means is that as a result of the serpent, a certain impurity was introduced into the world, and even a person who on his own is very pure and sacred and holy and completely connected to the divine source, but because they're living in the world, they are affected in one form or another by the energy of the snake. What we call in Kabbalah the Zuhama, in Kabbalah and Talmud, the Zuhama of the Nachash, the spiritual uncleanliness, the dirt. You may be very, very healthy. You may have a healthy immune system. But if you're in an environment that has noxious fumes, it will affect you. Living in this world is living in the world of the snake. And because of that, even these 4 people who were as pure as can be, they were affected by the snake. And because of that, they had to die because a part of them was affected by the snake, and that part has to die. As we explained before, anything that's not one with the divine is subjected to mortality and death. So when the Gemara says 4 people died because of the snake, it means they didn't die because of their own dissonance, but they died as a result of the dissonance they had within their system because of the snake. When the Arizal says, V'salisa Israelites, he's not just going back to an earlier stage. He's actually saying the person didn't die because of any sin, any corruption, any dissonance. The person died because of a tree that was planted by God. The person died because this was God's will. Now it's interesting because if you look in Gemara there, you'll see another category. Take a look, please, at source number 4. Zog the Gemara and Baba Basra Daf Yud Zayin Amid Aleph. Tanu Rabbanan Shisha Leishalot Ben Malacham of 6 people were not ruled by the angel of death. Ve'elein Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, Miriam. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam are 6 people that the angel of death did not dominate. Says the Maharal, the famous Rabbi Yehuda Leva of Prague, the 16th century rabbi of Czechoslovakia, Prague, in his Chidushei Agodis of Maharal and Baba Basra. They were on a higher level of the 4 who died because of the serpent. The 4 who died because of the serpent were on a lower level than the 6 who were not dominated by the angel of death. What's the difference? So one of the explanations is, one of the differences, the 4 who died because of the snake died because of a dissonance. The reality of death dominated them because a certain degeneration, spiritual, psychological dissonance between man and God was introduced as a result of the tree of knowledge. But then there's a higher level. The 6 people, the 6 people that were not subjected to the reality of the angel of death. As Rashi says, they died because God kissed them. was part of their journey with the divine. Nothing to do with their own blemish, with their own evil. And this quality, we'll understand, was revealed through the Arizal when it came to the Ramak. Why? Because every person has two layers. We spoke before about the body and the soul, right? The Torah has a body and the Torah has a soul. The human being has two layers, a body and a soul. And the soul itself has two layers. There's the exhibited external part of the soul and the more internal part of the soul. Where can there be sin? Where can there be dissonance, separation between the human being and God? Only in the external layers of the human personality. In our conscious mind, in our conscious heart, there can be dissonance between man and God, even in our subconscious mind and heart. But then on the deepest level, in the pnimius hanefesh, in the core of a human soul, in the core of a Jewish soul, there is no dissonance. To quote the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi in the second chapter of Tanya, "V'nefesh hasheni b'Yisrael chelik eloka mimal mamash." There's an aspect of the Jewish consciousness which is part of the divine, in which you're one with the divine like a child is one with the father. And there is a level where the child was one with the father and mother, but then you separate. And you can betray your father and mother, but then there's a level in which you are in the womb of your mother. There's a level where the child is still part of the seed of the father. You're completely one. There's no dissonance. We have that aspect of us in which there's absolutely never a separation between man and God. Over there can't be any sin. Over there can't be any fragmentation. Over there can't be any separation because it's mamash one. And the fact is that even Jewish law, Nigla, recognizes this truth. There's the famous verdict of Maimonides, the Rambam, in the Laws of Divorce, chapter 2, the end of chapter 2, Rambam Gerish and Perek Beis, where he explains that according to Jewish law, there are instances. Let's say halacha demands a person divorces his wife. Let's say he's doing certain things, but he doesn't want to. You could beat him, force him until he says, I want. And then he gives the divorce and it's a kosher divorce. But a divorce can't be coerced. He has to be wanting. What does it help? You force him till he says, I want. I twist your hand. I say I want. That's not called I want, says the Rambam. That because he's Jewish, in his depth he really wants. The fact he says I don't want, that's his external psyche talking. There's a deeper level that does want. The Rambam says this. So when he says I want, he's actually articulating a truth that's deep inside of him. The coercion is revealing something that's very deep, even though he consciously is denying it. So Jewish law, Nigla, recognizes this concept. On this level of the soul, there's no dissonance. On this level of the soul, there's no death because of the snake. Because on this level, there's no separation. Which part of Judaism began to talk about this aspect of the person? Kabbalah. Pnimius HaTorah, the depth of Torah, the soul of Torah, began addressing in a very systematic and organized and structured and emphatic way the depth of the human being and the depth of the Jew, the Pnimius HaNefesh. The Chelek Eloka Mimal. These are the teachings of Kabbalah, the teachings of Hasidus, which came to explain and elucidate and make the teachings of the Kabbalah relevant and palpable to everybody. So therefore, the Gemara says, Arba Mesu Bet Yoshel Nachash, operating on a more external level where the Nachash introduces dissonance and that causes death, even if not for your own shortcomings, but it's because of the serpent in the world. We're at the funeral of the Ramak, who was the teacher, the greatest teacher of Kabbalah till his time. He was eulogized by the greatest master of Kabbalah, the Arizal. A new dimension was revealed. V'salisa isialates. There's a part of a person in which there's no dissonance, in which there's no separation, there's no corruption, there's no flaw. Why did he die? Says the Arizal Kiyev ish chet mishpat maves. There's a person and there's no justification for death, not even the justification that he's living in a dirty world, that he's living in a tarnished universe based on the serpent's influence. Even that doesn't exist. Why did the person die? V'salisa oisalates. It's because of the tree that was planted by God. It's part of a divine, mysterious plan. defying the human imagination. It has nothing to do with the person's corruption. It's part of a person's relationship with Hashem, the journey that God wants for every person in their due time and place. And because every person has this aspect in them, this truth of the Arizal relates to everybody, even if not on a conscious level, but on a certain unconscious or superconscious level. So they tell the anecdote about three people who go into a cafe. A Catholic priest, a Protestant minister, and a Jewish rabbi. And they're all drinking a latte in Starbucks for $9.50. What are they going to talk about? They talk about what they would like to hear people say at their funeral. The Catholic priest says, I would like to hear somebody say at my funeral, he was a true servant of God. He served the Lord his whole life. And the Protestant minister says, I would like to hear somebody say at my funeral, he was a real friend. You can rely on him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He was a true comrade. Rabbi, what about you? What would you like to hear somebody say at your funeral? And the rabbi says, I would like to hear somebody say at my funeral, you know, I think he's moving. We are a people that loves life. We are obsessed with life. We hold life sacred and dear. We believe in life. And don't take this for granted, because after what the Jewish people have been through, you would suggest that if there is any culture who could have made a culture that glorifies death, it would have been the Jews. But they never did. They always heeded the words of Moses, "Ubacharta b'chaim," choose life, believe in life, rebuild life, continue to live. How did they do it? Because they took refuge in these words of the Arizal, V'salisa Eisei Eitz. They knew that despite the circumstances, and as many tears as they shed, there was some spark of goodness. It was their Father in heaven who loves them, who ultimately allowed this to happen. And when you know that it's your father, it's your mother who allowed this to happen, you may not understand it. You may still be very, very hurting. You may be in a lot of pain and an agony. But you know that if you dig deeper, if you excavate the surface and you get to the core of reality, you may be able to discover a spark of meaning and thus use it as a catalyst for yet deeper love and deeper life and deeper hope. And it's what took Jews through the long exile until the beautiful luminescent day when, as the prophet puts it, Bila hamavis lanetzach, u'mocha Hashem Elokim dima me'al kol panim. Death will be swallowed forever, and God will wipe away the tears from every face. And the days of grief and mourning will be transformed into happiness and glee. Have a good night.